Good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be with you again this week, and I'm happy for your presence. I'm encouraged by your presence. Those of you who are visiting us this evening, we want you to know that you are honored guests, and we appreciate so much your coming out and being with us during this gospel series. We began a series of lessons Sunday morning on the subject of human suffering. The first lesson we looked at dealt with why do men suffer. The second lesson dealt with the subject of why do men blame God when they suffer. Sunday evening we looked at the topic of, based on a passage in Acts chapter 20 and verse 24, where Paul said, "None of these things move me." It was a lesson that was designed to help us to remain unmovable in the face of life's hardships. Last night we looked at the subject of sickness has entered into this home. It was a lesson to help us to form, particularly those of us who are Christians, to form the proper attitude towards sickness and death. This evening, for the next few moments, Lord willing, I want to look at this subject that is on the screen before you. And it's simply entitled, "If Joseph Had Never Been Sold into Slavery." And it's a picture, if you will, of divine providence. As we face things in life, we must learn to rely upon our God. We must never lose sight of the fact that He is actively working on our behalf. And so I hope that we can achieve that goal tonight to, as we talk about these things, that we will be encouraged to know that there is a thing known as divine providence, and that God will work in the interest of His people. I want to begin our lesson tonight with an article, and this is going to serve as a background to our lesson tonight. And I credit Brother Paul Blake for sending this to me some time back. I believe Paul wrote the article, and I really want to begin with this. It's entitled, "Still a Janitor." And I quote, "An English author once wrote a story about a janitor at St. Peter's Church in London. One day, a young vicar discovered the janitor was illiterate and fired him. Jobless, the man invested his meager savings in a tiny shop, where he prospered. He bought another. He expanded, and ended up with a chain of stores worth over £1,000,000 sterling. One day, the man's banker said, 'You've done well for an illiterate, but where would you be if you could read and write?' 'Well,' replied the man, 'I'd still be a janitor at St. Peter's Church in Melville Square.' Often the things that appear at first to be misfortune wind up bringing us success and blessings in our lives. And this is illustrated many times in the Bible. If Joseph had never been sold into slavery, falsely accused, and then imprisoned, would he have ever been elevated to a position in Egypt that allowed him to preserve his family? Where would Daniel have been if he hadn't been taken into Babylonian captivity? Would he have ever had the opportunity to glorify God before foreign kings? Who would remember Zacchaeus if he had been taller? I've asked myself that question. Would the blind man in John chapter 9 ever have become a believer in Jesus if he had not been born blind? Would the centurion have come to Jesus if his son were not paralyzed and tormented? When the Apostle Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians, he was in Roman prison. However, he was able to see the good that had come from his circumstance. And he wrote, "But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which have happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ, and most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." If we will but take the time to look at our lives, we will often find what Paul found, and that is that misfortune and adversity have often resulted in positive spiritual, beneficial outcomes. I want us to key in particularly on that last paragraph. And let me just repeat the last sentence, that misfortune and adversity have often resulted in positive, spiritual, beneficial outcomes. About 1957, there were two little boys. Their names were Glenn and Eddie. These two little boys had an alcoholic father who, under the influence of alcohol, often became very violent. He never directed the violence toward the two little boys. At least they can't remember that he ever did such. But he always directed his violence toward their mother. On one evening, under the influence of alcohol, he pulled a pistol, a loaded pistol out, and threatened their mother with it. Of course, she left immediately. She left everything behind, everything she owned, including the two little boys. She did not realize at the time that she would not see either one of those boys for another 28 or 29 years. Those two little boys went into a foster care, under foster care because their alcoholic father wanted nothing to do with them. And so for the next 2.5 years, they were in at least 4 or 5 different foster homes. They can only remember one of those foster homes or anyone showed them any kindness. Anyone ever respected them. After a period of time, there was a couple in Ohio that adopted those two little boys. They didn't have to keep those two little boys together. They could have separated them, but they kept the brothers together. The couple that adopted them brought them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, you've never met those two little boys. You've never met Glenn, and you've never met Eddie, at least by those names. But I will say this, you now have met Glenn, because it is Glenn who is standing before you tonight teaching the lesson on the subject, what if Joseph had never been sold into slavery? I'll tell you later why my name was changed from Glenn to Vernon. If that's of interest to you, ask me after services. But I am no longer Glenn, I am Vernon. I understand what Paul is saying here when he says misfortune and adversity in our life often result in something positive. If that couple, or rather if my mother and father had never divorced, my biological father, and placed me in the foster care, I would have never come into contact with that couple who brought me up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I want you to stop and think about that for a moment. Where would I be today? I'd probably be wearing a striped suit with a number on my back. I'm not kidding there. But they adopted me. And they brought me up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So let's stop and think about that, and let's stop and think about these things that we've already brought to our attention tonight as we begin to talk about what if Joseph had never been sold into slavery. And really, as we think about our subject tonight, let us understand that what we're really talking about is a picture of divine providence. And as we examine this story, I hope that we will be impressed with the fact that God always works for the overall good and well-being of his people. Yes, we face challenges, but I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we have an ally in heaven. We lose sight of the fact that we have someone who cares about us, someone who works on our behalf. Sometimes we forget about that. He always works in our best interest, although in the moment we might not recognize that or even believe that he is. And yet, he is. The age of the miraculous is past. God no longer works in that way. And because he doesn't, we sometimes forget that God still rules in the kingdom of men, that he still rules in the affairs of men. But mark this down if you don't get anything else out of the lesson. Please understand this, that God will always rule in the interest of the church and in the interest of each faithful child of His. He may override my plans and arrangements. He may override my choices, good or bad, and those of my friend, in order to bring me to the point where He wants me, in order to mold me and shape me as He desires I shall be. And as you think about these things and how God works providentially in our lives, I think of not only the story of Joseph, but I think also of the story of Esther. And I'm speaking to an audience tonight that I fully realize that most of us here are familiar with both of these stories. But as we think about these two stories, there are 3 points of interest that I want to bring to your attention. I want to bring to your attention the statement of Mordecai as we talk about divine providence and what he said to Esther when she was really not all that keen on becoming queen. He said to her, "How do you not know that you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" How do you not know that, Esther? When we think about divine providence, that is a statement that we need to think about. How do you not know that what is happening in your life is happening for a purpose? How do you not know that? We need to think about that as we think about divine providence. In just a few moments, we're going to look at Joseph's statement found in Genesis chapter 45. And then I see the fidelity of Joseph determining to a great extent the outcome of his story. And that's very important. We must understand that no matter what we're going through, no matter what we face, no matter what the turmoil in my life consists of, I must remain faithful. I cannot allow Satan to pull me away. I cannot allow the current to cause me to drift from my relationship with my God. The story of Joseph is of interest to all readers, to all ages. To the little ones in the audience, to the old ones, like Bud. Okay. Not me. Okay. It's of interest, isn't it, to all of us. And as I think about the story of Joseph, there is 3 questions that I want to bring to our attention as we think about it. Why is there so much space given to this story in God's Word? You begin in Genesis chapter 37, and you end in Genesis chapter 50. If my math serves me correctly, that's what, about 23 chapters? Why so much space given to Joseph's story? Another question as we look at our subject tonight is this: why did Joseph, after he became governor over all of Egypt, and he had control over his own time, spend the whole 7 years of plenty and the 2 years of famine without going to see his beloved father Jacob? Jacob was only about 200 miles from him, and yet he did not. And the third question I want us to examine tonight as we talk about our subject is this: why did God select to be head of the 10 tribes of Israel 10 men who were so cruel and so inhumane as to take their 17-year-old brother and sell him into slavery? And again, by way of reminder, do not forget Joseph's fidelity to his God as the story unfolds. I think if we keep these things in mind, we will learn much about the providence of God and how it will work in our lives. And I suggest to you that as we're going through our trials and tribulations of life, we must have in the back of our mind the things that we're going to present tonight. That there is a God in heaven. I serve that God in heaven, and He will always work in my best interest. I may not understand what I'm going through at the moment. I may not even realize He is working in my life. And He does not have to work a miracle in my life, because He will not anyway. Those days are gone. In order to accomplish His plans and arrangements for me. You know, that's one of the most amazing things as I study about the Scriptures concerning God. It's always been amazing to me that he did not have to work a miracle to accomplish his plans. And he does not have to work a miracle to accomplish his plans in regard to you. Let's begin to examine the first question that I brought to our attention tonight, and that is the length of this story. Why is it so long? Well, there's more to it than just entertainment. And I think that will become evident to us as we continue on. But let us begin as we answer this question by talking just for a moment or two about the promise that God made to Abraham, found in Genesis chapter 15. He said to Abraham that you will have descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the heaven, as numerous as the sands of the seashore. And these descendants will inherit the land of Canaan. As we think about that, we also understand that his promise was not fulfilled overnight or immediately. No. We find out again in Genesis chapter 15 that Abraham comes to understand that it will be 400 years and more before his people inherit the land. Further, we learn through subsequent history what Abraham never knew, and that is that the land in which his descendants would dwell would be the land of Egypt, and that his descendants would be removed from that land and inherit the land of Canaan. Now I want you to stop and think about something with me here. Abraham died in Canaan, never having taken up residence in Egypt. He visited Egypt, but he never took up permanent residence in Egypt. Isaac, his son, never settled in Egypt. He visited Egypt, but he never took up permanent residence in Egypt. Isaac's son Jacob had no intentions of going to Egypt up to the very hour when his sons came back from Egypt the second time. He had no intentions of taking up residence in Egypt, none whatsoever. But again, remember the promise, and remember that Abraham's descendants would be foreigners in a land far from where he was at the moment. And they would be there for 400 years before they came out and before they would inherit the land of Canaan. So what brought Abraham descendants to Egypt? Well, Joseph was governor. But how did that come about? Well, because he interpreted Pharaoh's dream. You remember Pharaoh's dream? I'm sure these little ones could tell you about Pharaoh's dream. Remember the fat cows that came out of the, not me, but remember the fat cows that came out of the Nile? And remember the lean cows, the skinny cows that ate the fat cows? Remember that? 7 fat cows, these lean cows ate them, gobbled them up. Remember the grain stalk that he saw in another dream, and it had 7 full ears of corn or grain. And remember the thin and the skinny grain. Remember that? And it ate the 7 fat. Remember that? That troubled him. He wanted to know what that dream meant, what those dreams meant. Didn't he? Well, Joseph, with God's help, interpreted those dreams for Pharaoh. The magicians could not interpret it. And so the magician's failure to interpret the dream was necessary for Joseph being called upon to do it. But why was Joseph called upon? Well, you say, and those of you familiar with the story, if the butler had not forgotten his promise, who knows where Joseph would have been at this time, at the time of this interpreting. The forgetfulness of the butler was another necessary link. You ever forgot anything? I have. Yeah, I have. We don't think anything about it, do we? Well, this butler forgot. He forgot all about it. He forgot all about what his promise to Joseph. And because he forgot about it, Joseph remained in prison another 2 years. But why was Joseph called upon? Well, because the butler finally remembered. How did it happen that Joseph interpreted the dream of both the butler and the baker? Well, that depended upon their having dreams. They had those dreams where? They had those dreams in prison. And upon Joseph being in charge of the prisoners. But how is it that Joseph was in charge of the prisoners? Well, he behaved himself, and he was placed in charge of the prisoners. But why was Joseph in prison? Well, because Potiphar's wife made a false accusation against Joseph. And Potiphar's wife, or Potiphar, had Joseph put into prison. You ever ask yourself why he didn't have Joseph executed? He could have. When the Bible tells you that he was the head of security, or chief of the guard, he was the chief executioner is what he was. But he never had Joseph executed. He had him placed in prison. And how did it happen that she had a chance to make such an accusation? Well, because of her persistent nagging of Joseph to lie with her. And Joseph refused. Did he not? He refused. Time and again, he refused. On one occasion, he refused and he fled in haste. And she so happened to have a hold of his outer garment. And when he fled, that remained in her hand. And then, out of vengeance, she used that, and out of spite, she used that against him. And so her husband had Joseph placed into prison. But we ask this: how did Joseph end up being a servant of Potiphar? Well, he bought him. But what was Joseph doing on the market? His brothers sold him. Now suppose that he had never been sold into Egypt. He would have never interpreted the dreams. He would have never become governor. He would have never sent for his father and brothers to come to Egypt. And therefore, God's promise to Abraham would have never been fulfilled. And you would have not had a great nation of Israel. And without a nation of Israel, you would have no Messiah. Furthermore, if those slave traders would have been just 10 or 15 minutes later in their passing by, Reuben would have rescued his brother from the pit where the other brothers had placed him. But how is it that Joseph ended up in that pit? How'd that happen? You know how it happened, don't you? His father showed favoritism, made Joseph a coat of many colors. That made his brothers envious of him. And then to add insult to injury, Joseph had two dreams. He dreamed about gathering sheaves in the field, and his stood upright, and all the other sheaves bowed down to him. Oh, that didn't sit well with the brothers. And then he told them about another dream he had, where the sun and the moon and the stars all bowed before him. That didn't sit well with his brothers. And so when his father sent him out to take care, or to find out how his brothers were doing as they took care of the flock, they saw him come. Here comes that dreamer. Here he comes. Here comes Daddy's favorite. And they placed him in that pit. And they sold him into Egyptian slavery. The things that we have looked at are the causes that stand as links in a long chain for which God fulfilled his promise to Abraham. Now I want you to think about this. At no time did God directly touch the links of that chain except twice. When he enabled Joseph to interpret the butler and baker's dreams, and when he enabled Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Everything else was as natural could be. You had a father who showed favoritism, which is a lesson in itself. Giving his son a coat of many colors, which what? Which created envy and jealousy in the hearts of his brothers. You had brothers who were cruel and inhumane, and they placed that brother in a pit, and they sold him into Egyptian slavery. And God used the free moral agencies or the choices that those men made to execute his plans. I want us to think about that as we continue. That brings us to the second question that we ask ourselves tonight. And to help us understand Joseph's motives here, let us put ourselves in his place. Human nature is what it is in every generation. Now think about this with me. Here you are. You're a boy, 17 years old. All right. Your father has shown you favoritism. You've kind of flaunted that. I don't know any 17-year-olds that would do that. You even do not keep the two dreams to yourself. You share that with the family. All right. And look where that's led. Look where that's led you. Your father sends you out to see how your brothers are doing with the flock. Your brothers see you coming. You do not have the slightest idea what's lying ahead for you. You get to your brothers, what do? They strip you of that coat of many colors, and they place you down in a pit. Here you are, a 17-year-old boy, placed in a pit. Perhaps you think your brothers are joking, but they're not joking, are they? They're not playing a joke. No. What would be going through your mind as the time passed? Look what Joseph was facing here as a 17-year-old young man. Then he's brought up out of the pit. And he's there before not just his brothers, but these Ishmaelite traders. He knew what they were. And he could hear his brothers bargaining. Well, how much? How much? And they settle on what? 20 shekels of silver. He's sold to them. How would you feel at that point? Would your world begin to start crumbling down around you? What would be going through your mind? Don't distance yourself from him. Human nature is what it is in all generations. Perhaps Joseph had one thought to bear him up. My father loves me. He will come for me. But he didn't. He's sold to those traders. He's taken to Egypt. He's placed upon the selling block, and Potiphar buys him. Years pass. And then there is prison. And more years pass. 13 dark, long years. And his father did not respond. How does he feel toward his father and his brothers? Well, the way he felt about this is revealed to us in Genesis chapter 41, if you would like to turn there with me. And notice verse 50. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of the famine came. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and my father's house. Look what these years have done to him. It gives you an insight to what he felt at this point. Is it not? And yet all the while now, through all of this, he has remained faithful. Remember when Potiphar's wife said, try to get him to commit adultery with her? He said, how can I do this great evil and sin against my master and my God? 13 long years, and yet it had an impact on him. And we see how he felt about his father and his father's house, but yet we also see what he felt about his God. Everything is going well, better than he could have ever imagined. As he's now elevated to governor of Egypt, second in power, second only to Pharaoh. Look where he is. Look where he started, and look where he now is. So everything is going well for him. And then one day, his steward comes and tells him that there are 10 foreigners who have come to buy food. There's a great famine that has now come upon the land. It is plaguing the people. And among those who were plagued by that great famine is Jacob and his sons. And so they go to Egypt, the only place where there is any grain to be sold, and we know why. We know why, because we know what those dreams meant, and we know that Joseph said that there'll be 7 years of plenty and there'll be famine. And we know what Joseph did during those 7 years, and there's these great storehouses of grain and so forth. So Jacob sends his sons to Egypt. Joseph wasn't ready for that. He just wasn't. When his steward comes to him and says, look, there's these 10 foreigners who have come to desire, they've come and they're desiring to buy food, he realizes these are my brother. They did not recognize Joseph. Why would they? And Joseph instantly treats them in such a way that they will never come back. Look at Genesis 42 and verse 9. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them and said to them, you are spies who have come to see the nakedness of the land. That's the way he treated them. That's what he said to them. In verse 10, as we continue, and they said to him, no, my Lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's sons, and we are honest men. Your servants are not spies. Honest men? Aren't you the men who placed me down in that pit? Aren't you the men who drew me up out of that pit? And aren't you the men who sold me to the slave traders for 20 shekels of silver? And you come before me and you're telling me you're honest men? Honest men, are you? But as we pick up the thought in verse 16, he says this, send one of you and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. You're spies. So he put them all together in prison for 3 days. Then Joseph said to them the third day, do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house, but you go and carry grain for the famine of your houses, and bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words will be verified, and you shall not die. You see, when they mentioned that they had a younger brother, that struck a chord with Joseph. You see, Benjamin wasn't party to what they had done. And Joseph desired to see that younger brother. And so he formulates a plan to bring that younger brother to Egypt to be with him. And as we looked at here is the beginning of his plans. If you are honest men, then let one of your brothers be confined. Let him stay here. He's going to be in prison. But you go home and bring that younger brother to me. Bring him to me. In verse 21, then they said to one another, we are truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear him. Therefore this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them and said, did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. When Reuben said this was a complete revelation to Joseph. He didn't know this. He didn't know this was Reuben's attitude toward him. He didn't know Reuben would have taken him up out of that pit and saved him. And we notice his reaction. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter, and he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned to them again, and he talked with them, and he took Simeon from them, and he bound him before their eyes. It didn't thwart his plan, but we see how he was caught up with emotion. And now he's going to put these brothers to the test to see if they have really changed. Look at verse 25. Then Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grain, to restore every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. Thus he did for them. So they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. But as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey feed at the encampment, he saw his money there, and it was in the mouth of the sack. And so he said to his brother, my money has been restored, and there it is in my sack. Then their hearts failed them, and they were afraid, saying to one another, what is it that God has done to us? And then they went to Jacob, their father, in the land of Canaan, and they told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man who is Lord of the land spoke roughly to us and took us for spies of the country. But we said to him, we are honest men, we are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is with our father this day in the land of Canaan. Then the man, the Lord of the country, said to us, by this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me. Take food for the famine in your household and be gone, and bring your youngest brother to me, so I shall know that you are not spies, but that you are honest men, and I will grant your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. You see the plan of Joseph here? Do you see the impact of what Joseph did here? You see that impact upon these brothers? Now notice the impact that this information had on their father. Then it happened as they emptied their sacks that surprisingly, each man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob, their father, said to them, you have bereaved me. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. And you want to take Benjamin? All these things are against me. You ever feel that way? We all have, haven't we? All these things are against me. Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you. But he said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him along the way in which you go, then you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Jacob said, no. As far as I'm concerned, Simeon's lost to me. Joseph lost to me. Now Simeon's lost to me. I'm not about to send Benjamin with you. That was Jacob's answer to Joseph. But time goes by. The famine becomes very severe in the land. In verse 2, and it came to pass that they had eaten up the grain which they had brought from Egypt, and that their father said to them, go back and buy us a little food. But then Judah spoke up, saying, no. No, the man solemnly warned us, saying, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send your brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. And Israel said, why did you deal so wrongfully with me as to tell the man whether you still had another brother? And they answer him. Okay. One thing leads to another. And as time passes, they return to Egypt with their younger brother Benjamin. Now notice in chapter 43 here and verse 29, notice what it said. Then he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, that is Joseph did, his mother's son, and he said, is this your younger brother of whom you spoke to me? And he said, God is gracious to you, my son. Now his heart yearned for his brother, so Joseph made haste and sought somewhere to weep. And he went into his chamber, and he wept there. He is very close to fulfilling his plan. He washed his face. He came out, and he restrained himself, and he said, serve the bread. And so they set a place by himself, and they had set him a place by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat food with the Hebrews, for it was an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked in astonishment at one another. Then he took servings to them from before the Lord. But Benjamin was given 5 times as much as any of them. So they drank and were merry with him. As we come into chapter 44, notice what he tells his steward as he sends now the brothers back, along with Benjamin, to their father's house with the grain that they had come to Egypt to purchase. And he commanded the steward of the house, saying, fill the men's sack with food as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack. Also put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, and with his grain money. So he did according to the word that Joseph had spoken. And so they depart. And they're on their way back to their father's house. And Joseph commands the steward to go after them. And so the steward goes after them, takes his men with him. And as he catches up with them, he finds the silver cup in Benjamin's sack. They're scared to death. They have no idea now what's going to happen. None. And so the steward brings Benjamin back. But not only is Benjamin back, the brothers follow him. Now imagine Joseph's surprise to not only see his steward returning with Benjamin, but with the other 10 right behind him. So what's he going to do? In verse 16 of chapter 44, we read the following here. Then Judah said, what shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Here we are, my Lord, slaves. Here we are, my Lord's slave, both we and he with whom the cup was found. But he said, far be it from me that I should do so. The man in whose hand the cup was found, he shall be my slave. And as for you, go up to your father's house in peace. Now notice what takes place. Then Judah came near to him and said, O my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's hearing. And do not let your anger burn against your servant, for you are even like Pharaoh. My Lord asked his servant, saying, have you a father or brother? And we said to my Lord, we have a father, an old man, a child in his old age who is young. His brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. And we said to my Lord, the lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. Joseph finds out something here that he never knew. Judah makes two revelations to Joseph. He quotes from his father. And as we drop down to verse 27, he says, then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. And the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. Joseph never knew that. And for 22 years, he's been blaming his father for not coming to Egypt to get him. 22 years. No appearance of his father. And as we continue on, he realizes something else. In verse 29, but if you take this one also from me, and calamity befalls him, you shall bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with me, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will happen that when he sees the lad is not with me, that he will die. So your servants will bring down the gray hair of your servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his father, or up with his brothers. Look at the other revelation here. He now realizes these are changed men. These are not the men who placed me in the pit. These are not the men who sold me into Egyptian slavery. A change has come over these men. The very men who had sold me into slavery are now willing themselves to become slaves when it appears that Benjamin has been guilty of stealing. Keep us. We will be your slaves. Let this young man go back to his father. That had an impact on Joseph. Immediately, Joseph changed. We see his change of heart toward them. He embraces them. He weeps. He reveals himself to them. Furthermore, Joseph now sees the hand of God through all of this strange and sad experience. We've been a long time getting to this point, and I appreciate your kind attention, but here's what it's all about. I want us to look at chapter 45. And I want to begin reading in verse 5 of the chapter. Notice what Joseph says. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Joseph sees the hand of God in this. Joseph now understands why it is that I was put in that pit. Why it is that I was sold into Egyptian slavery. Why it is that I spent all those long years in prison. He now understands. He now sees. As he looks back upon the events as they unfolded, In verse 6, for these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great delivery. Do we understand what Joseph is saying here? If Joseph had never been put into slavery, he would have never become governor of Egypt. If Joseph had never been put into slavery, Jacob would have never went to Egypt, nor any of his posterity, nor any of his children. And if they had not gone to Egypt, they would have not grown into a mighty nation in that foreign land. And there would be no Israelite nation, and there would be no Messiah. But I want us to notice this. All you see here is the providence of God. That's all you see. He took natural events. He took decisions that men made, events good and bad, that comprised this chain of events, and he fulfilled his plans in regard to his promise to Abraham. And aren't you glad he did? Or we wouldn't be here tonight in this capacity. Joseph's brothers would not have survived. The famine would have overtaken them. Joseph now realizes all this as he looked. He didn't realize it in the moment. No. As we oftentimes do not realize it in the moment. And sometimes Satan uses that to his advantage, and we allow him to draw us away from our relationship with God, and we go through these things, and we ask ourselves, where is our God? Well, understand he's where he has always been, and understand that he is always working in the interest of his people. And understand he doesn't have to work a miracle to accomplish it. Joseph sees the hand of God in all of this. So now, verse 8, it was not you who sent me here, but God, that he has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler throughout all the land. Now it comes home. Now he sees. Now he understands. Is there a lesson here for us? Absolutely. There's a lesson here for us. And here it is. Many times when we have passed through dark and deep waters, and we have and we will, and that's a lot of all men. But many times when we have passed through the dark and deep waters, looking back, we can see the grand and blessed promises that God had in mind, or the purposes, rather, that God had in mind. And so, like Joseph, what we need to do is remain loyal to our God and do not question that he is working in your best interest. Well, I've mentioned these three earlier this week, but this is the kind of faith we need to develop. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego again said to Nebuchadnezzar, we're not going to bow to your idol. Nebuchadnezzar said, if you're not going to bow to this idol, then what God will deliver you from my hands? They said to him, the God whom we serve will deliver us from your hands. But they didn't stop there. They went on and said, but if he chooses not to serve or not to deliver us, we will still not bow to your idol. That's how much faith and confidence they had in their God in heaven above. And I suggest to you that that's the same amount of faith and confidence that we have to have in our life. When we pass through dark and troublesome times, let us understand that God is working in our best interests. And whether we ever have the privilege that Joseph had and looking back, and now we can see. Still, we must have the faith and confidence in Him that we will abide by Him. One more thing, and the lesson will be yours. This third and last question that we want to look at is very simple. It was not the 10 men who sold their brother into slavery that God selected, but the 10 who were willing instead to become slaves themselves, that their younger brother would not become a slave. And if you and I are to make it to heaven, it will not be because of what we once were, but rather it will be because of what God has made out of us through His dealings with us. One writer put it this way, and I quote, "This world is as good as any possible world for the purpose God has in creating it. That is, to be the ideal environment for soul making. Every instance of human suffering results from some condition or conditions which was necessary to provide man with the ideal environment of soul making." Let me leave you with this thought. This world is temporary. It's not our home. Let's let God work in our lives. Let's let Him have His way with us. We have not yet experienced heaven. None of us have been there. But what God is doing with us, even in regard to these trials and tribulations that we go through, He is molding us and shaping us for that heavenly home so that we will be ready for it. It is nothing like what we experience here. Nothing. So let Him have His way with us and never question divine providence. God is preparing us to live with Him, molding and making us into what is necessary for us to dwell in that heavenly home. I trust that the lesson has been beneficial to you. I trust that you've been encouraged to put your faith and confidence in God in heaven above and understand that He will always work in the best interest of the church, and He will work in the best interest of His children. Now, we may not fully understand how the mechanics of all that, but don't question it. Tonight, if you're not a child of God, we encourage you to become one. If you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, repent of your sins as He's asked you to do, confess your faith in Him before this good audience, and be baptized in water for remission of your sins. Child of God, if you've fallen away, we encourage you to come back to the fold of safety tonight. Well, you have time and opportunity to do so, won't you? As we stand and we sing the song.